Hey, fun fact, you are the first returning guest on my
Woohoo!
podcast. The very first returning guest.
I love it. Well, I'm honored. Thanks.
I am also honored. You're one of my favorite voices out there right now, and
Oh, thanks, Tom.
you're really, you're staying in the vein of Christian orthodoxy, and but you're saying things so differently,
Mm.
and radically, and I think you're creating the container that is needed, or helping create the container that is needed for what Christianity is going to look like for this, next age, because we're still
Mm.
using this medieval container that
Yeah.
just doesn't seem to fit anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
So I really like your voice and what you're doing and what you're saying. And recently, what you've been saying is kind of getting you in some hot water with the denomination. So you are with the Nazarene denomination. Do you want to give us a little bit of a preview, snapshot of what it means to be a Nazarene?
Yeah, the Church of the Nazarene it's only about 100 years old. It's a break off of the United Methodist tradition. Its theology is very similar to United Methodism, or the various Methodist families. It has an emphasis upon sanctification. That's been understood in a variety of ways over the 100 years. In the United States, there's about 500,000 Nazarenes, and there's about 3 million worldwide. We're not probably, we are more conservative than most American Methodists, and in terms of on social issues. But our theological vision, drawing from John Wesley, is pretty much the same as a United Methodist theological vision.
So this is kind of in that Wesleyan tradition. So you'd have like, the Methodists, which is United and Free Methodist, Nazarene,
Yep.
the Wesleyans. So what kind of, other than like social issues, what might set the Nazarenes apart from a Wesleyan or a Methodist, Free Methodist, or United Methodist?
Well, the Wesleyan Church has a little more fundamentalist view of Scripture than the Church of Nazarene. They have a sort of, I would call it, an absolute inerrancy position on the Bible, whereas the Church of the Nazarene says the Bible inerrantly reveals all things necessary to salvation. So it's got a salvation kind of focus, and we're free to think the Bible is wrong about things about science or whatever history. Um, in terms of the emphasis, the Church of Nazarene broke away because it kind of thought the Methodists were getting too liberal on a variety of stances. Those might be things like dancing and drinking and tobacco. The Nazarenes today are much mellower on those issues than they were 100 years ago. So there's not necessarily a big a difference, except on the queer issue. The Church of Nazarene is decidedly more conservative on LGBTQ plus issues than what the recent vote in the United Methodist Church, at least in America, has been.
Yeah. So you're kind of on the front end of that in the denomination, trying to progress things for an inclusive stance in the queer. What has your process been like? I know you've released a book on that. What else have you been doing on those front lines?
Well, maybe I should say that my view on this changed way back in 1991. I
Oh,
was a
wow.
seminary student at the time, and I and some other friends decided we were going to take up the challenge of thinking through what in those days we called the homosexuality issue. And after looking carefully at the scriptures, thinking about it in terms of psychology, sciences, reason, history, I ended up concluding that a Christian could, in good faith, be a fully affirming Christian. But I knew that my denomination was not close to taking that stance. And so then the next question for me was, do I stay in this group or do I leave it? And I have so many connections and a history. And I discovered that there were lots of other Nazarenes who thought that we could be affirming as well. So I decided I would stay and try to make changes from the inside. And so I've done that in various ways in the last 30 years, but only in the last five or so has this become more public, and I've had charges filed against me for my advocating.
Now, what does that look like to have charges filed against you in, like, I know what it means in like a court of law, but what does it look like maybe in a denominational setting?
I'm guessing every denomination is a little different, but in the Church of the Nazarene, it works like this. A person can file accusations against an ordained elder or another member, but in my case, I'm an ordained elder. And I had some accusations filed against me late in 2021. And the only accusation that had any teeth to it was that I was queer affirming. So my district superintendent gave me those charges and asked me what I wanted to do, and I decided I was going to face them. And the first step is what they call a hearing. So I wrote a long defense of myself, and I met with a group of about, I think we were 5 clergy and 2 laity or something like that for a couple of hours. And at that meeting, I was very blunt and straightforward. I said, yep, I am LGBTQ plus affirming, and I think the denomination ought to be. And that group then, they had the task of making a recommendation to what we call our district advisory board, and they're the ones who really decide whether or not I'm going to be disciplined. Well, that hearing committee, even though I was very blunt in my rejection of the denomination's current stance on human sexuality and my full affirmation of queer people, that group recommended that I not be disciplined, which surprised everybody. But the district superintendent ended up taking away my assignment as an elder. And then last summer of 2023, some local people on the district at the working with my district superintendent filed official charges for my discipline.
So how do you go from this meeting saying, no, you're all good, to no, it's moving forward? Is there a step I'm missing, or is that not transparent?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. One of the differences is in the meantime, I had edited with my daughter a book of 90 essays making the argument that the denomination ought to change. I had done some podcast interviews. I had done various things in the denomination to try to push forward a change on the queer issues. And so the charges that were given me in the summer of 2023 are 2. One is the charge that I'm teaching doctrines contrary to the doctrines of the Church of the Nazarene, and the other is that I'm engaging in conduct unbecoming a minister for my attempts to try to change the denomination on this. So I guess what changed is my aggressive work to try to get the denominations to change made people upset, and they think that that's conduct unbecoming a minister.
So it's just your advocacy. There isn't anything else.
No, there's no
going on.
moral issues or anything like that. And I myself am a straight cisgender guy, so I'm not queer. It's all about my advocacy that they don't like.
Now, I didn't even know denominations did this. When you posted your video, that you're under investigation and you're facing a trial. I was just thinking to myself, like, what world do we live in? Like, are they going to burn you at the stake? Like, is that how this works when we're done? Or like, what are going to be the consequences of this trial if it doesn't go in your favor?
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing what will happen is they'll take away my credentials as an ordained elder. They might also take away my membership, I don't know, but probably at least my credentials should I lose my case.
Will that affect what you're able to do? Like, you've been writing books and hosting podcasts and creating conferences around open relational thought. Is that going to influence your current capacity to do what you do?
No, it shouldn't influence any of that. I used to work at a Church of the Nazarene University, but I now direct doctoral programs at Northwind Theological Seminary, and so that work isn't in jeopardy on this. I will lose my life insurance and some other things related to the denomination,
Mm.
but I'm not going to lose my job.
Okay. Well, that's kind of the overview of the situation. I'd like to just kind of dive in to the topic a little bit. How did this, queer affirming, how did this become the single divisive issue of the church with
Yeah.
very little biblical support for it? Because, I mean, we've seen this in the United Methodist Church, we've seen it in the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, Reformed Church in America, and it's like dividing them. They're creating new denominations out of all this, Global Methodists, and whether Reformed have the ARC thing going on. Like, how did this become the single dividing thing when there is such little biblical evidence for this?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that by saying what I hear from both sides is their primary motivation on the issue, and then I'll give you what I think is really going on. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for.
My opponents would say that the Bible clearly states that homosexuality is what they would say, but queer people, most of them would be, the careful ones would say queer behavior, in other words, same-sex sexual activity, or, well, that's usually what they talk about. They would say the Bible is clearly opposed to that, and they would cite about 6 or 8 passages that I and others don't think are clearly in opposition to what today we consider healthy same-sex relationships. But my opponents would say, we're acting against Scripture. My allies, the people who think like I do, will either look to those passages, those 6 or 8, and say, no, they don't really apply today, or, they're speaking about something different. They're speaking about, let's say, older men having sex with young boys in the Roman period, or they're saying, oh, that's all about reproduction, and that's what, man shall not lie with a man, or patriarchy, or something like that. Or people on my side will say, yeah, maybe those biblical passages do condemn same-sex behavior, but they're written from a particular perspective that we no longer share. And take the Apostle Paul, for instance. Apostle Paul isn't exactly a strong advocate of women's rights. You can point out some passages in which Paul seems to be saying things that at least folks who are patriarchal use for their arguments. He also wasn't really strongly against slavery like we are today. And so some people on my side would say, yeah, maybe Paul was writing in ways that would not be queer affirming, but he was just wrong, and we should love people no matter what. So those are the kind of 2 most common arguments you hear in the public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's more fundamental is things related to aesthetics. That is, I think my opponents get grossed out when they think about queer same-sex behavior. I think I call it the yuck factor.
Mm.
And so they imagine same-sex activity between women or men or whatever, and they think that's just not natural, that's gross, and then they use the biblical arguments based on their aesthetic assumptions. Whereas I find more people in the affirming camp, like I am, don't have the same visceral aesthetic reactions to that, to same-sex sexual behavior. So I think aesthetics is really driving a lot of what's going on.
I've not thought about the aesthetics perspective, but it's interesting if you look at the history of how the church has evolved and where we've stood on social issues. It seems like the hot button topics are always in flux and always changing.
Yeah.
In the 1900s, early 1900s, it was a very puritanical form of, morality that was really being pressed. Don't drink, dance, or chew, or go with girls that do, was kind of like the
Yep.
motto that they said, and that whole 3 to thrive method, you got to be at church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday, 3 to thrive.
Ah,
And that whole morality hot button topic, like even in my lifetime, I've seen it evolve. But it seems as though like one of the major narratives of the Bible is like an opposition to empire for the sake and welfare of those on the margins and those in need. How is it that we take like the main thing and like push it off to the side and then drag our hot button issues, whatever they might be, even though they flux in and out, and bring that to the central stage? Do you like see us doing that again, and how does it happen, and how do we combat that?
yeah, I think there's a tendency amongst most, I'm tempted to say all humans, but I'll just say most humans, to have a clear understanding of right and wrong and have some kind of authoritative structure to adjudicate what's right and wrong. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if the world was just black and white and we were all, on one accord on every issue? And so when something comes up like slavery or the rights of women, a role of women or whatever, I think some people yearn for a clear measure to assess these things. Now, I don't think such a clear and certain measure exists. I think Christians ought to use the law of love for their overall measurement, and that's not as clear as people would like it to be. You have to do some work to discern what love requires, moment by moment, instance by instance, issue by issue. But this desire for a clear and certain measuring stick by which we can clearly say this is right and that is wrong, I think a lot of people want that. It's just that I don't think that exists.
Now, if you look at the Old Testament narratives, like that's where everything went wrong.
Yeah.
We want a king, and then they get King Saul. And I mean, not that things were going great in the period of the judges, but you know that if you look at Walter Brueggemann, he says when he established the monarchy and the static temple, that is the paganization of Israel, and it's all downhill from there.
Yeah.
And there seems to be this desire for people that we want a confident, sure leader to just concretely say right, wrong, black, white, and set up this dualistic way of thinking. Do you think there is any benefit to having some form of that? Maybe it's really mutated now, but is there a healthy way to hold kind of that duality, like we need to know these black and white, rights and wrongs kind of a thing? Is there a healthy way to hold that doesn't polarize us against one another?
Yeah, it's really hard. I've offered one, my ultimate law of love. I think that's black and white in terms of what it means
Mm.
in theory, but in practice, there's lots of gray area in figuring out what it means. Um, I do think a lot of people would like, at least they say, they want someone else to do their thinking for them. They want the
Mm.
strong man, the one who never makes any mistakes. And that might be a pastor, it might be a president, it might be a king, it might be a military leader, somebody who's got a crystal clear, absolute standard that they know with certainty. I think a lot of folks like that because it means that they don't have to worry about the doubts that they foster in their own lives. But
Mm.
I also have seen that once people get a person like that, that person never comes through as being absolutely perfect, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if it's Donald Trump, let's say, then it becomes pretty clear that he's not the morally perfect person. And then those who follow him have to justify why they continue to follow him. And it gets murky really quickly. But
Yeah.
let's set Donald Trump aside. I mean, any kind of king, any kind of pastor, there's always going to be some gray areas and flaws.
Yeah, I think that's kind of built into the DNA of
Yeah.
Christianity, is that we want that strong person, usually a man, at the front leading things. And I've had that projected onto me I'm a pastor, and when people show up to my church, it's almost like I can feel the projection come in, like,
Yeah.
oh, here's the man
Yep.
he knows. And it's almost like it's something that they wish, a confidence that they wish they had, but they don't. So then they project it onto another person because it's safer for them to have it for me on my behalf. And yeah, I see that in a lot of people are really insecure with, they just don't understand who they are. And, they need those clear right and wrong, black and white boundaries because they're not secure and confident in who they are. On their inner life. They haven't done the inner work to find that authoritative voice that can come about when you do the inner work. So then they just kind of project what they wish they had out onto another person. And I do get that as a pastor, and then people are sorely disappointed in me rather quickly when they find out I'm not as confident as they want me to be on all their certain hot button topics. And
Well, I think there's also a developmental aspect. Yesterday I was with my 5-year-old granddaughter, and at that stage in her life, she really needs pretty much black and white ways of looking at the world. She
yeah,
hasn't developed the cognitive abilities to think through the complexities and the grayness of life. And it could be that some people never get past that early youth cognitive development. But I think most people, when they hit their teenage years or 20s, they all of a sudden see that life has a lot more nuance and complexity than what they were told when they were 5.
yeah. I remember. I'm surprised that you say that you became queer affirming in 1991. I did a paper in, I think it was early 2000s in my bachelor degree, and I read a queer affirming theological book for I think it was like a youth and culture class, and we had to take that topic on. And it was an authoritative source, but I didn't give myself permission to read it as it was, so I set it up as a straw man. I wrote a paper knocking it over. I presented it to my class, and everyone applauded it. They just loved it. The teacher even came to me and said, "You did such a good job on that. I can't believe you even read that book." And I told that story to Justin Lee, who was on the podcast a little bit a while ago, who wrote the book Torn. And I didn't have the confidence to really look at it for what it was. I just adopted what the church and the culture has just been handing me. But then I really started to look at things and do some shifting in the late 2010s or early 2010s or something. And I'm in a small town, little church in a small town. And I thought, you know what, I understand some things about, some of the letters LGBTQ plus. I know there's a lot of letters there. I understand the first 3 pretty well, but I probably won't have to talk about them for a long time. We're in a small town. I said that in the springtime, and that summer, 3 of the kids that grew up in this church came out as queer.
Oh, wow. Huh.
And I said, wow, here it is on our doorstep.
Yeah.
And so I started to be more open with what I privately believed but I was not so confident to say out loud. And so it took me that long. And so I'm surprised that this happened for you back in 1991. Were you kind of like leaning in that direction already and something opened you up to it? Or, did you have an experience with maybe, a friend or a family member who that kind of influenced that for you? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I'm the weird one here because most people start to rethink their position after they have a close relationship with a queer person, family member, friend, past classmate, someone in the congregation, whatever. For me, the only person I knew who was queer was my brother-in-law, and he's a jerk. And I'm not the only one in the family who thinks that. I mean, he did not make me want to affirm queer people because he just wasn't a good guy. So I ended up changing my mind primarily on intellectual grounds not personal relationship grounds. Now, later on, I ended up having friendships with queer people, and it sort of affirmed what my intellectual decisions had come to. But yeah, I'm not like most people here. Most people, it's someone in their family, and they makes them rethink their views.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did your evolution into this from 91 to now? What did that kind of look like? I know the field has changed and more letters have been added, and
Yeah,
it's very complex. I don't understand it all,
yeah.
certainly. But how does your understanding evolved over the days?
Yeah, for probably the first decade or so, I used the language of homosexuality exclusively, and I thought mostly in terms of, uh, you know, uh, same-sex attraction and behaviors amongst men and men, women and women. And then I started getting to realize there's other things going on, but really the so much of the field in gender studies has changed so much in the last 10 years. And I think, well, before I get to that, I should say this. One kind of turning point for me was in the early 2010s. I can't remember what year, but I'm going to guess around 2011 or so. There was a movie came out called For the Bible Tells Me So. I think it was a PBS special, and it featured Eugene Robinson, the first openly gay Episcopal bishop, and it interviewed families who were dealing with this. And at that time, I was, what we would now call fully affirming. So was my wife. But my daughters were in their teenage years, and we decided to sit down and have them watch this film. And when we finished that, we had a conversation, and I thought to myself, this is going to make a difference down the road for my girls, because they now know that their parents don't agree with the denomination that they're a part of, and that they have to talk about this in ways that, are more private to people. And then my kids go off to school. They get college degrees. And my middle daughter ended up getting a master's degree in gender studies from a school in Boston called Simmons University. And that really helped me. Now she teaches me the latest terminology, and she helps me, try to use the right language. Um, and so I'm learning now from my kids when in the past I was teaching them.
Mm. Yeah, I sat down with a young woman just this past week, and she's transitioned genders from male to female, and transition name. And I said, this is something that I don't understand. Yeah, I feel like I've got a good grasp on the first three letters,
Yeah.
And she just looked at me and she says, well, would you like me to teach you? And I said, yeah, actually, that would be great. And she just kind of told me her story of growing up in the church, never fitting inside of her own skin and body, and just her mental struggles about that. And what that moment, I just kind of shut up and just said, I need to listen and learn in this moment.
Yeah.
And I
That's
did.
really
And
good.
yeah, that was a moment where I was just like, there are things I don't understand that this young person here can teach me. And so I just sat down and listened, and man, it was pretty, I'm still chewing on a lot of the stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the best ways to get people to start thinking about the queer issues is to start with the case of the intersex person. Intersex is the word we use for people who are born with genitalia that are ambiguous. You don't know if it's a penis or a vagina. And those people, I think the average Joe Blow sort of on the street, they understand that if you can't tell if it's a penis or a vagina, that there can be some problems there, right? And so if a intersex person is assigned, let's say, a male, but thinks that she's a female, it's understandable why that would be the case. And then the next step, after you go from kind of the biology to, and then look at, then you start thinking about attractions and orientation. I think people can start to understand that a little better if they acknowledge the intersex issue.
Yeah, it seems like, it's almost like the mental health issue. If somebody has a broken leg, we say, oh, we have to make accommodations for this person with a broken leg. Here's a crutch, here's a thing. But if you don't have a visible, diagnosis, then it's more like, well, what's wrong with you?
Right.
Why can't you do this? And now we're getting the understanding like, well, there's ADHD and there's depression and there's, all of these different neurological. We understand how the brain works a whole lot more than we have in the past. And I don't think that the church we haven't been open to letting science inform us at all in a long time. But I think that we need to get to that place where we can delve into the sciences. I mean, even John MacArthur, I think a couple of years ago, said that there's no such thing as depression. You just need the Bible.
Yeah.
And it's like, that doesn't make sense.
No.
I mean, maybe it makes sense in a very tiny little world where, the Christianity is this subculture that seeks to be dominant over the whole world. But it doesn't make sense in human biology and neurology and what we understand about how everything works.
Yeah.
I think this is another one of those things that we don't understand how this all works, but we can't deny that this is a real thing anymore.
Right. I think one of the ways in which my approach to the queer issues might be a little bit different from some of my other affirming friends is I think the critics are right to ask the questions of sin. Is same-sex sexual behavior sinful, or is the orientation towards same-sex attraction sinful? I think that's the right question to ask. And now I think the answer is different from what my critics think. My critics think that same-sex sexual behavior is always sinful, and I don't think it is. But I think the questions we should ask is, does this activity, this orientation, this identity, can it be healthy? And I'm convinced that same-sex sexual behavior can be healthy. I'm not saying every queer couple is engaging in healthy sexual behavior all the time, because not every heterosexual couple is engaging in healthy sexual behavior. But to me, that's fundamentally the question. And so then when the arguments start to sort of play out in the public sphere, or in my case, it's going to be a trial, I'll make the case that to really love a queer person is to acknowledge that they can engage in healthy queer behavior. And so then the question is, okay, who gets to decide what's healthy? And here I will rely upon not only psychological studies, but the scientific consensus. I'll rely upon anecdotes and relationships I have with queer couples who have, at least apparently from my standpoint, a healthy relationship. And this really bothers my critics when I say, if a person is truly loving, if a Christian really wants to love the queer people, then they will affirm them. This bothers them a ton, my critics, because my critics want to say they're loving queer people, right? They don't want to give up the love word to me. And usually the way they'll frame it is they'll say, well, I'm loving this queer person by telling them it's against God's laws. So they think of love as telling another person God forbids you to engage in same-sex sexual behavior. And rarely do those people actually listen to queer people. Whereas I think love requires listening to others and trying to assess, not coming in with this sort of set of rules that you think of derived from some source, the Bible or elsewhere, but really listening and engaging not only the queer couples, but also the literature, the science, etc. And so I stick with my charge that loving Christians, will fully affirm queer people, and that just makes my critics mad.
Yeah, you're taking, I wouldn't say taking, you're just revealing that it's not there. Love on their end isn't there.
Yeah.
And when I was talking with Justin Lee, who wrote the book Torn about, coming out as queer in the Southern Baptist Church, he said that, those clobber passages, that they would be quoted to him all the time. And, his response was, okay, so what do I do with it? This passage just says, that's wrong, you're wrong. And what the church has not done in those previous stances is tell them, then here's what you should then do. We don't have good answers for that. It's always just, well, stop it, embrace celibacy for the rest of your life. And I guess the depression that comes with that, and loneliness, I don't think we had good answers then, and I think you can really make the argument that how we have attempted to answer this so what problem has been wrong every time so far. Why do we think we're getting it right now? The conversion therapies and all that kind of stuff, that is proven to not have worked, but all of our eggs went in that basket at the time.
Yeah.
How are we, I guess I'm trying to phrase this question properly, but we're putting our eggs in what basket now? Like, other than we just want them to, we know that conversion therapy doesn't work. So what does the church say to that what now question? Or what?
Yeah, well, I'm putting all my eggs in the love basket.
Yeah,
But
well, that's a good one. What would your opponents do?
yeah, I think my opponents want to put all their eggs in a particular interpretation of Scripture basket. And so then if I want to engage them on their own turf, then what I do is I bring all these biblical scholars who make arguments like the ones I'm making and say, look, you don't have the majority of biblical scholarship on your side. You do have probably the tradition, the way that probably most Christians have thought about queer issues in the last 2,000 years. Not everybody, but probably the majority. But if you ask the majority of biblical scholars who, give papers at the Society of Biblical Literature every year, if you ask them about the queer passages, the majority think like I do. So the person who wants to use Scripture has got to wrestle with what the scholars are saying about the passages they think oppose queer behavior.
Why is there such a big gap between the scholarship and the pulpits?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of reasons. One, a lot of scholars don't know how to write in a way that the average person can understand, and probably some of them are scared to write in a way that the average person can understand because they'll get kicked out like they're trying to kick me out. So I think there's some fear that scholars have there. And again, I'm going back now to a theme I mentioned earlier. I think there's some aesthetic issues at play that make it so that I'll call it the lay critic of queer people doesn't really want to take to heart what the scholars are saying because they have this yuck feeling when they think about queer sexual behavior.
Yeah. I know that Walter Brueggemann has come out affirming, and he's like the Old Testament scholar. He's like the N.T. Wright of the Old Testament in my mind.
Yeah.
He's brilliant. Eugene Peterson, I remember he did come out in an interview with Tyler Huckabee right before he passed.
I didn't know that.
But then Lifeway said, "Are you sure that's what you like?" He said something along the lines of, "I think their spirituality is just as good as mine." But then Lifeway, which is a branch of the Southern Baptist Church, owned the Message Bible and threatened to pull that. And he was about to pass away, and that was what he was leaving his family. And ever since that moment, there was like I saw the power blatantly on display, and I thought that is really icky.
Well, and in just the last few months, there's been the teaser of a new book from Richard Hayes and his son, and they apparently have changed their mind to be to an affirming position, which is a pretty big deal in the circles I run in because amongst my critics in the Church of Nazarene, Richard Hayes was really the only true scholar they could point to be non-affirming, and now apparently he has changed his mind. So I think you know this. There's always been a gap between scholarship and laity, And some scholars try to bridge that gap. Some laity try to read scholarship, but I think they're in the minority. There's usually doesn't they usually don't come together very well.
Yeah. You know,
Well,
the issues that we're facing, you know, with global poverty and economic or ecological crisis and, you know, the conservative political agenda, like marrying to the, you know, the Christians and all of these huge issues that we're facing, it just seems like, this is the time to make the headway on this. So I'm really thankful that you're taking a public stance the way that you're doing. I'm really sorry that it's panning out the way that it is. But if things don't go your way, how do you, how will your life kind of form after that moment?
yeah, I'm not really sure. I I think there's a good chance I'm going to lose my case. So if I lose, I'm not going to be surprised. Um, what I do next, I don't know. Do I join another denomination? Do I not? I haven't really thought that through. I'm going to wait until I'm at that point to make that kind of decision.
Mm.
Um, I could have walked away from the Church of Nazarene an awful long time ago, and even when I was given the charges. But I want to stay and try to make some room for people who come behind me, even if it means I get pushed out. I think that the polls show that younger Nazarenes think like I do, and younger people in general. And so I think there's going to be a transition eventually, not only in my denomination, but in most denominations. So if there's something I can do to contribute to that, even if it means me getting pushed out, I think that's positive. Plus, I get notes from queer people almost every day right now, or allies thanking me for taking the position that I have taken because it encourages them to see someone who can articulate a vision of God's love that includes them. And so that's one of the main reasons I'm doing what I'm doing as well.
Yeah, and like you're showing that you're humanizing the issue,
Yeah.
whereas you know the people who are accusing you are making it into an idea or a theology with verses attached
Yes.
to it, and you are infleshing love to actual people. And you also have great ideas because your mind is brilliant. You're an academic. You're a
Uh,
scholar, but
Thanks, Tom.
you're not living there. You're bringing that embodiment to of the way of Jesus to, you know, the people that I believe that Jesus would love, and you're not just making it an idea. So thank you for not just living in your
Uh,
head like most scholars do.
I appreciate your encouragement. It is one of my goals to try to find language that is widely accessible.
Mm. Yeah. Well, who's been someone who's come alongside you to support you, maybe in a way that you're a little bit surprised that happened?
Hmm. Well, I think I knew that amongst the scholars of my tradition, most of them thought like me, but the price that a person pays for coming out so boldly as I have done is pretty high. And I've been pleasantly surprised at the number of scholars in my tradition who have come out in support of me and queer people in this project. So that's been encouraging.
Mm. So with the young people behind you, with the scholars behind you, and uh, just a really clear, solid. Even before you passed I don't know what it was called when they brought you to council. You passed the council.
Yeah.
Um, why do you think this one might not go in your favor if you have all of those things behind you?
Because I think the leadership in my denomination isn't where I'm at, and there's very vocal conservative voices that are not where I'm at. I think I'm probably going to lose the short term battle, but my eyes are on the long term change.
Do you foresee a split of the Nazarene Church and denomination like other denominations have, or do you think they'll get on
Yeah,
board?
I don't know. I could see a split. I mean, I can also see a continuation, or even not just continuation, an increase in number of people who just leave voluntarily. I like to say that when people accuse me of trying to split the Church of Nazarene, I like to say we've been splitting for a couple of decades now, mostly as our young people walk out the back door.
Yeah.
It may not be a public two sides kind of a split, but if you look at Pew Research, the Church of Nazarene and the holiness traditions in general, we are the worst of all religious groups at retaining our youth.
Really?
And the number one reason, I suspect, is the queer issue.
I did not know that. I look into the Pew Research because, I'm in this world. I'm in the church world. I'm a pastor. I'm doing the work.
Right.
And I like to know the stats that are out there. And I knew that, the Southern Baptist Church is in record-breaking decline with young people leaving that church. But I didn't know that the holiness tradition was kind of the worst on the spectrum of retaining young people.
Yeah, and I'm citing a 2007 Pew Research study and a 2014. I haven't seen anything in the last couple of years, but in those studies, the only people worse than the Nazarenes or the holiness tradition at keeping their youth are the atheists. The atheists can't hang on to their youth. Yeah, that's right.
I did not know that. Well, that is interesting. Is there is there some resources that you could point to people that are not going to be so scholarly and academic? Just the average listener to this, that they want to explore this issue. What are some helpful books or resources or podcasts that you point them towards?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is a book by David Gushee called Changing Our Mind. It's gone through a couple editions, so if you want to get the most up-to-date one, I'd get that. I'd also point people to the book that I edited with my daughter called Why the Church of the Nazarene Should Be Fully LGBTQ Plus Affirming. In that book, the first set of essays are written by queer people telling their stories. Then the next section of essays are written by allies, and the final section by scholars. So if you, for instance, want to know how to handle some biblical passages, that last section will help you in that. Or if you want to hear stories, the first section. And also, this is maybe more specific than what you're asking, but I'm not sure when this recording will become available, but sometime in mid-June, I'll publish my defense that I'm going to give at my trial in July, and it's just called My Defense. And so if folks are interested in the details of what I'm going to say, that'll be available by mid-June.
Okay, this is this one will drop next week, because when you sent me the email saying, hey, just the FYI, this is going on, I jumped you in line. So
thanks.
I want to get this out there right now, because
I appreciate that.
Just sharing the video, that's all right, but having you on for a long form conversation, I think, was going to be that's what I prefer. I want to hear your voice. I want to get these questions in front of you, and then get this content in front of some people. It's going to be helpful. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, so your trial's in mid-July. We'll be keeping our eyes towards that horizon, and I'll be behind you in any way I can here from Michigan.
Thanks.
So, yes, best of luck to you. Is there anything that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, well, what I care about most in life is trying to live a life of love. And doing that sometimes leads me into situations like I'm in right now that are uncomfortable, that are stressful, that make people upset. But I do it because I think that's what love is calling me to do. I don't want to claim like I've got love all figured out, got God all figured out, but I'm doing the best I can, given the resources I have, to live a life of love.
Well, thank you for that faithfulness. That is a beacon of light in some dark times that we're in right now. Thank you.
Thanks.